We reported in the last section the breaking news: daily coronavirus cases in England increasing by 10,000, taking the total to 27,900 a day. This is according to the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. Last week's estimate was 17,200 per day. The week before that, 12,600. You see the direction of travel, but with the rapid increase in numbers and more towns and cities entering tighter restrictions, is it now time to just cut to the chase and say, let's go for this 2-week lockdown idea? Let's speak with Lord Michael Howard, former Conservative leader. Michael Howard, afternoon to you, sir. I mean, your party has... Well, you've certainly resisted it. Boris Johnson has resisted the 2-week suggestion by Sir Keir Starmer, but it looks as if we're kind of almost jigsaw puzzle style going in that direction anyway.
Well, for a long, long time, people, including the Labour Party, were asking the government to take a localised, targeted approach. And that's what the government's doing, and I think it's the right thing to do. I don't know where we're going to end up, but at the moment, there are parts of the country which have pretty low rates. And it seems to me that it would be wrong to impose on those parts the kind of restrictions, very irksome, burdensome restrictions, which many of the rest of us are having to put up with.
And in terms of where this story goes, I mean, this is the $64,000 question. The greatest epidemiologists on the planet, the SAGE Committee, no one is completely sure by definition of this pandemic what it's going to do next. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer's point was apparently made, or his idea or proposal was made on the back of what SAGE had said. So the government have talked often about following the scientific advice. Would it not make sense then to follow this advice, which was for a 2-week lockdown?
Well, no, as I say, the government's got to be guided by the advice, but the government's got to take all sorts of other things into consideration as well. The government's got to strike the right balance between protecting the NHS, saving lives, and not actually driving our economy into complete lockdown. It's a very, very difficult balance to strike. You're quite right about the uncertainty. Harriet Harman was quite right in the clip you played from her before. This is completely unprecedented. No government has ever had to deal with something like this before. It's an incredibly difficult challenge, but I think it's right, so long as we can, to take a targeted approach, a localized approach, so that those areas which are sadly experiencing the highest incidence of the disease have to put up with the toughest lockdowns. Those areas of the country which do not have very significant incidence, which have very low rates, why should we impose unnecessary burdens on them?
Where do you sense, and of course we keep hearing politicians tell us they're not making politics out of this. It seems to be a slight irredeemable reality now that there are some quarters of or some parts of the political spectrum who are clearly trying to make political capital out of this. We've just had this sort of curious standoff between local mayors and central government. What are you making of this? I mean, I appreciate politics. Does politics really change? Is it just the characters that change? When you were Home Secretary, when you were leader of the Conservative Party, I'm sure myriad problems and issues came your way then too. Maybe it doesn't look that much different when you're sat in those positions. We do seem to be in an extraordinary place in terms of political polarity, the likes of which I haven't seen for a long time.
Well, first of all, nothing that I ever had to deal with, or any of my colleagues in government when we were there, remotely resembled the kind of challenge the government faces today. I think this is of a different order of magnitude in terms of difficulty, uncertainty, and threat and danger to people's lives. So it's a really unprecedented and difficult situation. Ideally, it would of course be better, would be best, if there could be a consensus politically, if the government and the opposition could work together. That would be ideal, but we're not seeing that. And I must admit, I'm very disappointed with Andy Burnham, who I know a bit and who I've always had a lot of time for, actually, but who now seems to be saying he isn't prepared to accept tougher restrictions on Manchester if they're proposed by Boris Johnson, but he is prepared to accept tougher restrictions on Manchester if they're proposed by Keir Starmer. I think that's very disappointing.
Yeah, I think that point hasn't been lost on certainly a lot of our callers, and people getting in touch with us this afternoon are noticing this this rather curious place that we've ended up in that respect. I guess the other issue, though, that perhaps many would say goes in Keir Starmer's favour in terms of his lockdown position are this huge increase in the number of people who are testing positive. Doesn't mean, of course, they have coronavirus. They may have had it. They might have it with very mild or no symptoms whatsoever. When we see figures like 27,900, which, as Harriet Harman told us earlier, is likely to transpose at some point into hospitalizations and maybe deaths, is that a wake-up call, do you think? I mean, is that the guiding factor? Is it just the numbers that the Prime Minister will be looking at?
Well, the numbers are very important. And you say, is it a wake-up call? I don't think anyone's asleep. I think everyone is awake to all the difficulties.
Well, we'd like to think it's not always looked like that of late, of course.
No. Everyone's awake to the difficulties which these figures pose. Fair to say that they won't all lead to hospitalization, that there are now improved methods of treating COVID so that it doesn't have quite the same terrible consequences that it had earlier on in the pandemic when we knew much less about it. But I remain of the view that, of course, you've got to keep a look at the national figures, but where there is such a big disparity as we see at the moment between those areas like the West Country, where there's very low incidence, and Liverpool and Manchester, where there's very high incidence, I don't think a sort of one-size-fits-all approach at this particular moment in time would be right.
Michael Howard, I'm bound to ask you, just before we finish, a story that does feed into this, of course, because if this wasn't enough on the Prime Minister's plate, there's a little matter of Brexit to try and sort out. We learned in the last few hours the UK has to get ready for a no-trade deal with the EU, Boris Johnson has said. What do you make of that news? That's a fairly gargantuan statement from Boris Johnson.
Well, I think it was in response to the statement from the European Council, which simply said the UK's got to make concessions. That's not the way to negotiate. If we're to get a deal, and I'm still hopeful that we can get a deal, there will have to be compromises on both sides. I was very encouraged, particularly by one report which I saw recently, something I've been saying for years, which is that if there is no deal, there will be a series of mini deals to minimize any disruption that might otherwise occur. And I think that is what is likely to happen if there can't be an overarching agreement. I hope there will be. I think there can be. But if there isn't that overarching agreement, there's still time to put in place mini deals which would minimize the disruption to transport, air travel, all the other things that might otherwise cause difficulty.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that M20, a road you've probably done more miles down that road than many other politicians because your constituency, of course, was at the end of it at one point.
And I still live at the end of it.
I was about to say, yeah, still your neck of the woods too. So I travel on there myself quite a bit too. I mean, the idea that this will become a massive lorry park and mobile toilets being put up at the side, the arterial roads taking a knock-on effect. You can't bury your dead. You can't put the rubbish away. I mean, these are all the sort of doomsday scenarios that people throw out.
I don't think those things are likely to happen. I think we'll be able to bury the dead and do all the other things you've mentioned. And I think that the preparations have been made to keep traffic flowing along the M20. Probably there will be some disruption, but I hope it can be minimized.
You're confident of a bright future outside the EU?
Oh, yes. We are a country with fantastic potential. There are so many areas of economic activity which are more and more important as the 21st century progresses, where we are world leaders. So I think we can do very well, and I hope a deal can be reached. I'd like us to continue to be able to trade with the European Union without any tariffs or quotas, but we have a bright future.
Lord Michael Howard, that's the first bit of positive news we've heard from any guest in the last week, I think. So more than happy and delighted to have that imparted on the programme. Thank you. Lord Michael Howard, former Conservative leader, of course, former Home Secretary. I like his last point. We have a bright future. That gave me a little shiver up the spine there, because when was the last time we had any conversation with anyone about anything that involved a positive phrase like that? We have a bright future. I concur. It's just come at a right old torrid time, though, hasn't it? Man alive, it couldn't. The timing of all of this is horrific.